Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Health and the Public Interest Graduate Programs Weekly Seminar. I want to thank everyone for, in these difficult times, I know for all of you for making time to check in and attend a seminar. I know all of us have been affected in one way or another by what's going on with federal funding and jobs and all of the disruptions that are taking place. We empathize with all of you who have been affected in terms of funding or even employment, and I'm sure we'll be bringing this up in the weeks to come. Today's seminar by Gary Schwitzer is one I've been looking forward to, and Michaela Henry is going to introduce him formally. First, I just want to say a couple words about the program and the seminar procedures. The Health and the Public Interest Program, you'll see the link in the chat momentarily, is a program that emphasizes the social determinants of health and the other non-medical or non-clinical determinants of health, including economic factors, the role of pharma, both of which kind of factor into today's talk, I believe. And we welcome your comments or interest in the program. There are various ways that those who are interested in the program can visit or find out about it through information sessions if you're interested in attending. So the seminar is going to be about 45 minutes long. It's going to be moderated by Michaela Henry, who's going to first do an introduction. After the talk, we will take questions and answers moderated again by Michaela, starting first with students and then moving to the larger audience. So thanks for being here. Thanks, Gary, for your participation, or Dr. Schweitzer, and Michaela, I turn it back to you.
Hey everyone, my name is Michaela Henry, and today I'll be introducing Gary Schwitzer. Mr. Schweitzer specializes in healthcare journalism and had a 50-year career in radio, television, interactive, multimedia, and web publishing. He was the founder and publisher of healthnewsreview.org from 2006 to 2022, providing a unique service to a million users a year at its peak. To name a few of his other roles throughout his career, in 2013, Mr. Schweitzer was named to an adjunct associate professor appointment from the University of Minnesota School of Public Health. From 2001 to 2010, he was on the faculty at the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota, teaching journalism and media ethics and earning tenure in 2007. In 2000, he was the founding editor-in-chief of the Mayo Clinic Consumer Health website, and in the 1980s, he worked for 4 years at the National Office of the American Heart Association. Mr. Schweitzer has been published numerous times, including by the Journal of American Medical Association and the American Journal of Bioethics. Ladies and gentlemen of the HAPI program and our listeners, join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Gary Schweitzer.
Well, thank you. I'm going to dance back and forth between being on camera and my slides. So let me just start with the title slide for now. I will end with these social media connections on a slide later on. So you don't have to jot all this down right now if you're interested.
Gary, can you put that in slideshow view?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying. There. Okay. So I really am pleased to have this opportunity to talk with you today. Welcome to the HAPI students, the graduate health and the public interest students, and to others who have joined us today. I'm going to talk with you about the work that I've been doing, and I did it with a large team of as many as 50 people for several years on the website healthnewsreview.org that doesn't exist anymore. I've tried to continue that work even into retirement. And in a nutshell, it's work about helping people improve their critical thinking about healthcare. So we'll come back to the slides a little bit later on. For at least the last 40 years, I've earned all these gray hairs. I've been restless much of the time, often dissatisfied, often unhappy with the status quo in the way that healthcare has been communicated to the general public. The US simply does not have the best healthcare system in the world, despite what we're often told. It's top heavy with administrative costs that are far too high. It's not equitable, leaving far too many people uninsured or underinsured. And of those who have insurance, far too many still have to make daily choices between paying for their health care or paying for food on the table or something else in their lives. We spend far too much on healthcare and don't get a return on that investment on many days. International data shows that the US spends the most on healthcare as a share of the GDP, but ranks poorly on health outcomes. US healthcare is far too beholden to special interests, drug companies, medical device manufacturers, insurance companies, and others. It's an industry where MBAs and lawyers are often valued more than MDs and RNs. Now, journalists, media folks, communicators of all sorts didn't create these problems, but the majority of news organizations haven't done enough to address them. On healthcare topics, many news organizations read and sound and look more like advertisers or public relations professionals than they do look like ethical journalists. Through 16 years of daily publishing on myhealthnewsreview.org site, we showed how nearly 4,000 news stories and public relations news releases emphasized or exaggerated the potential benefits of healthcare interventions while minimizing or totally ignoring the harms and also the costs. The majority of the time, and we'll back this up with numbers later, they failed to evaluate the evidence, often being spoon-fed by what someone with a vested interest told them. They fueled the innumeracy of many in the audience by failing to adequately help people quantify how small the potential benefits of an intervention may be and how large the potential harms may be. And now the squeeze on journalists every day is clamping down on them even more. With vast newsroom cutbacks, those left behind are expected to meet daily quotas and to do more with less time, with less help, with less concern. Today, some big money owners of news organizations are driving staff and many of us readers away. Newspapers and magazines now under billionaire ownership include the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the LA Times, the Atlantic, Time, and Fortune. On social media platforms, what Elon Musk has done with X and what Jeff Zuckerberg has done with Facebook is shameful. So I'm very sympathetic to the journalists who have stuck it out in this environment of professional turmoil. And some continue to deliver in the midst of all of this, some of the finest investigative healthcare journalism that we've ever seen. Some of it philanthropic foundations supported, like Kaiser Health News and ProPublica. But we can't lose sight of the old saw about journalism, that it's the job of journalism to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And in this current environment, I think it's a good prediction that's less likely to happen. All right, I'll go back to my slides. So back in 2006, I launched healthnewsreview.org, actually began working on it in 2005. So we're 20 years away from that. And there's no way I thought we'd still be talking about this 20 years later. What you're looking at is one of the last homepages that we put up before we lost funding in late 2022. When you look at some of these headlines, you get a brief but a good sense of what we focused on every day for 16 years. And I do mean every day. There were days, I remember it felt like the dog days of summer, and we were publishing as many as 13 pieces in one day, not in 1 week or 1 month. So here's a little bit of the nitty-gritty about our operation. Beta preparation in 2005, and then launched in 2006, every day for all these years, and then I hung on for another 4 years after funding expired. We did 2,600 news story reviews and graded them and published those grades, and you'll hear more about that. Later, with additional funding from our philanthropic source, we were able to add public relations news release reviews, which is often where the faucet gets turned on for the pollution of the message to the general public. In addition, so that while we were concentrating with those other two entities about news, on our blog, we broadened our scope, looking at advertising, marketing, social media, talk shows, books, health policy, journal editing, journal publishing issues, and other public health issues. We expanded into podcasts with journalists, healthcare professionals, researchers, and others. We had a really good toolkit of tips and resources to help people improve their critical thinking. And I was joined by a team of as many as 50 reviewers, including journalists, clinicians, researchers, and 4 women with a history of breast cancer who were really smart in evaluating evidence, who went through training offered by the National Breast Cancer Coalition right there in Washington. So this was a wallet card that I'd give out at conferences. Journalists would gobble these up. We also had mouse pads with this on. And these were the 10 criteria we applied to the stories we reviewed that made a claim about an intervention. So if you're going to tell us that this intervention is wonderful, did you adequately discuss the costs, adequately quantify the potential benefits, the potential harms? Did you evaluate the quality of the evidence? Did the story commit disease mongering? And by that we mean exaggerating the prevalence or the seriousness of a condition. Are you going to treat toenail fungus as if it's coronary artery disease? Did you use independent sources, and did you identify conflicts of interest in the sources? Did you compare the new with existing alternatives, establish the availability of the intervention, or are you telling us about something that isn't even, you make it sound like it's available at the corner drugstore, and it's not even in major markets yet? Did you establish the true novelty of the approach? Or as I often say, with the Super Bowl coming up, is this the 7th erectile dysfunction drug that we're going to see ads for on the Super Bowl? And did the story appear to rely solely or largely on a news release? Well, the 5 poorest performers of those 10, in my mind, inarguably were the most important. And these are the 5 in the left-hand column here. So in the blue column is the percent unsatisfactory scores on those criteria. And the yellow column is the percent unsatisfactory in 600 public relations news releases on those same categories. So just drop back to the wide shot here, and you see this is an abysmal report card on the pollution of the message through trusted sources to the American public. Behind those numbers, I could point to more recurring problems, but these are 4 that really consistently bugged me, and I'll go into these in detail. Using numbers that made benefits look bigger and made harms and my font look smaller. Not explaining the limitations of surrogate endpoints or surrogate markers. Not including independent perspectives, or not disclosing conflicts of interest, and a bias, a pro-screening test bias in many messages about cancer tests and others. So one by one, we'll look more closely at these. So number 1, the numbers game. which is often a matter of the problem of telling us only about relative risk reduction and not absolute. And I'll break this down if you're not familiar with that. And a classic example of misleading relative risk reduction numbers came years ago with the drug company Merck's rollout and promotion of its drug Fosamax for osteoporosis. So Merck's marketing boasted that this drug reduced the risk of hip fracture in women with osteoporosis by, 50%. But that's relative risk. You want to know absolute. Relative is the treatment group compared with the non-treatment group. One data point relative to another. Anytime you hear big effects, 50, 40, 30, 20%, always ask yourself two things. Of what? 50% of what? And here's the nitty-gritty on Fosamax's of what. The pivotal trial that got this approved showed that hip fractures occurred in 22 of 1,000, 2%, in a group not taking Fosamax, compared with 11 of 1,000, 1% taking Fosamax. So you ask 50% of what? Well, half of 2 is 1, so it's not 50%. In absolute terms, it is a 1 percentage point absolute risk reduction. So the bottom line is you want to, journalists ought to, always demand anyone, public relations people, anybody pitching, promoting an intervention, ought to demand and use absolute data. One woman out of 100 may have benefited from Fosamax, but the other 99 in a real world setting had to pay for it, run the risk of little side effects like esophageal irritation and what's called dead jawbone, where a drug that's supposed to help with bone strength actually weakens it in parts of the body, and they would get no benefit. But we don't know who that lucky one will be. If you fixate on that 50% relative risk number, you will never get to these important nuances. Problem number 2, we don't discuss the limitations of surrogate endpoints and markers. What are we talking about here? Well, what do we really want to know in a trial? So if it's a trial of an intervention, you want to know, did this help people live longer and better? Now that may require longer, more expensive trials, which helps explain why there's been an explosion in cheaper, smaller, quicker trials that point to surrogate endpoints. A surrogate, like any other use of this term, is something that takes the place of something we'd really like to know if we were more patient, could take the time, had the money for the longer, more expensive trials. But when studies report findings only for surrogate endpoints and you don't get or give an explanation of what this may not mean, that's a problem. So I'm going to give you 2 poster children for drugs approved based on surrogates, an old one and a newer one. This is the granddaddy here, the CAST trial, the cardiac arrhythmia suppression trial, way back in 89 to 92. So behind this, people who have heart attacks have a high risk of sudden death, presumably from heart rhythm problems. Heart specialists hoped then, as they do now, that new drugs to stop the arrhythmias would stop the sudden deaths. This trial showed the new drugs did suppress the arrhythmias. Sounds like a home run. But that was just a surrogate endpoint. What about overall survival? Did people live longer and better? And that was a big oops. Total mortality was significantly higher in the groups that took the anti-arrhythmia drugs. You can treat the arrhythmia. Did people live longer and better? An article in Circulation, co-authored 20 years ago by who's the now outgoing FDA director, Bob Califf, called it perhaps the most dramatic failure of a proposed surrogate outcome. A BMJ article on lessons learned stated in the future, mortality should be given greater emphasis as a principal endpoint. Yeah, gee, do you think so? But let me tell you, 20 years later, that still often doesn't happen. As with 2021, when the FDA okayed generic name aducanumab, brand name Aduhelm, for Alzheimer's. They approved it based on a surrogate. The surrogate was, did you reduce plaque in the brain that is thought to, but over and over and over again has not been proven to cause Alzheimer's. But the two pivotal trials actually contradicted each other, which led the FDA advisory committee to vote nearly unanimously against approval. And 3 members of that advisory committee resigned when the FDA went ahead and overruled their objections. Side effects are common and potentially serious. The drug maker originally set the price at nearly $60K a year, but cut that in half when it wasn't doing slam bang on the market. Some call this one of the worst FDA decisions in recent history. The BMJ tackled this problem. I love this cover. The people bowing down. They called it the idolatry of the surrogate, the cult of surrogate outcomes. The bottom line, surrogates are not unimportant, but journal articles, news releases, news stories, the public dialogue, and public policy based on studies that only point to surrogate outcomes must also discuss what surrogates don't tell us. If you don't see that, buyer beware. Problem number 3, we don't include independent perspectives, or we don't disclose conflicts of interest. So remember back on the chart about the grading from Health News Review. Remember the poor grades for news stories I showed you? Well, and the grades for PR news releases were even worse. Well, some of those poor news stories were based on poor PR news releases that almost never include any independent perspective, just the promotional interests of the client or the employer or the university, the medical center, the drug company, et cetera. It's not the job of PR to do anything but to please make their researchers and make their research from their university look as good as it can be. I think it was a European journalist who mashed up this term infoxication. Doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Fox News. It's information intoxication from, in this case, a polluted stream of conflicted news and information drowning the public. So let's start at the big ladder on the right. That's where spin at the outset is applied by government, universities, medical centers, pharma, device industry, specialty medical groups, journals, on and on. So they dump their spun message on the people who work for them, the PR people for any of the above, who dump it on the journalists, who often unwittingly apply their own spin, who dump it on us at the bottom of the food chain here, the general public, and we don't even know we're being spun. And I'm telling you, many days you are. So on Health News Review, we often told the general public that whenever they heard news about a new treatment or a new study, if it didn't include a truly independent expert perspective and didn't explore conflicts of interest in the people making the claims, run for the hills, because the fox is guarding the henhouse. A fundamental problem at the root of all of this is that being published in the New England Journal, or you name your favorite journal, is not akin to Moses coming down from the mountaintop with the stone tablets. We are way out of whack with the reverence that we give to journals. We tend to lose sight of the fact that journals were never meant to be a source of the daily news cycle. So a steady news diet of the journal du jour is simply unhealthy. Problem number 4, the bias in media messages about screening. Many PR people and journalists through the years, and we've tracked this, especially TV journalists, give the impression that screening tests are slam dunks, all benefit, no harm. Through the years, countless TV people have reported on their own screening and delivered statements not based on evidence, claiming that their lives were saved by screening, something that simply cannot be proven. Just a few examples. ABC's Bill Weir did a full body CT scan on the air. CBS's Katie Couric, maybe one of the most famous, and then later her colleague Harry Smith, at the breakfast hour having colonoscopies on the air. NBC's Matt Taibbi did lung screening on the air. NBC's Andrea Mitchell talked about the reasons for her own mammogram and misused one of the most misused statistics, which I'll come back to later, the 1 in 8 women statistic. NBC's George Lewis had a PSA blood test, bragged about it, then had expensive proton beam therapy for prostate cancer. NBC's Matt Lauer and Al Roker, another fun breakfast hour encounter, having digital rectal exams on the air. I'm not making this up, folks. Two similar stories, though, involve TV newswomen, both of whom had televised mammograms as part of Breast Cancer Awareness Month promotions. So maybe the best known of these is then ABC's Amy Robach, who had a mammogram on TV for Good Morning America Goes Pink Day. Her coworker, Robin Roberts, who also has a breast cancer history, guaranteed her if she did this, this would save lives. Later, Amy revealed she had breast cancer, gave no details about the diagnosis, the stage, the grade, lymph node status, which she's entitled to keep that to herself. But I don't think so if you're going to go public with your diagnosis and then talk about how other women ought to do this. She chose a double mastectomy. She said the diagnosis and treatment saved her life. I believe, I think a lot of people do, that it's unethical to use your network TV platform to deliver an opinion on what should be a highly individualized, evidence-based, shared decision-making discussion between patient and doctor. Her story went on to be reported in hundreds of shallow, incomplete news stories across the country. Another more recent one was a local news anchor in Oklahoma City, Allie Meyer. She was convinced by a breast center marketing person to have her first mammogram on Facebook Live. She later told us that it found calcifications, not cancer, in one breast. She followed her surgeon's advice for a mastectomy. There was no discussion of how calcifications and cancer are not synonymous. The National Breast Cancer Coalition called this story an example of potential overdiagnosis and subsequent overtreatment. They said there was no reporting about the severity of the condition, nor the other less invasive options for treating this early disease. A year later, Meyer said she had a clear mammogram and was cancer-free, both of which are troublesome statements. So here's more on what's wrong with some of these screening messages. In this case, the breast cancer marketing woman who said, I thought this would be easy, no big deal, 30 minutes and we'd be in and out of there, which shows incredible naivete or lack of knowledge. And she's the one who talked the local reporter into doing this. Neither of those stories presented ideal decision-making. Amy Robach was convinced to get her first mammogram by a coworker. Allie Meyer was convinced by the marketing person and then said that several surgeons said she needed mastectomy. There were options here. This was not a matter of need. This was a time for shared decision-making. Robach said she initially resisted the mammogram, worried that it would feel exploitative or stuntish to do it on the air. In the end, that's the way it felt. There was no discussion of how early first mammograms increase the chance of false positive test results. Such stories undoubtedly sent many women in, as Katie Kirk's colonoscopy did, for earlier than needed testing, generating fear and anxiety and potentially heading off a cascade of potentially needless interventions. If you're going to go public with your diagnosis, as I said earlier, you owe it to others to reveal the actual biology, the staging, and the likelihood of recurrence of the diagnosis. What does it mean, as the one woman said, to be told you have a clear mammogram and no evidence of disease? Troublesome statements to make with confidence on the air. Now, Andrea Mitchell, and she said, I am now among the incredibly 1 in 8 women in this country who have had breast cancer. One of the most common misleading stats about breast cancer. 1 in 8 is a lifetime risk. Women of all ages face the following chances of being diagnosed with breast cancer. Any of these come close to 1 in 8? If you're 30 to 39, 1 out of 233. If you're 60 to 69, comes about the closest, 1 in 29. Over a lifetime, 1 in 8. We don't get that explained to us in pinkwashing period of Breast Cancer Awareness Month. So the bottom line, journalists shouldn't advocate for or against screening tests, but in 16 years on Health News Review, in dozens of examples, we documented a pro-screening bias in many stories. Patient advocacy organizations should not advocate in the absence of evidence. There are clearly important trade-offs between screening and not screening, so decisions should reflect the values and preferences of an informed patient. Patients trying to make these decisions need more fact-finding and less fear-mongering. Journalists, it seems to me, are kind of like carpenters. They can be skilled builders. Carpenters build structures that provide us safe environments, safe homes, workplaces, schools, hospitals. They are taught, measure twice, cut once. Journalists should build their stories that way. They should guide decision-making by people who are in need of balanced, complete, evidence-based information. They too can provide structure for a safe, sound decision-making environment. Journalists should be taught, analyze claims and evaluate evidence at least twice before you cut, before you hit publish, or else, just like a hurried carpenter, you may be doing more harm than good. I've added some links here at the end. I'm going to move on from this slide in a minute because I assume these slides will be given to the students and a video will be available later. The top JAMA Internal Medicine was a piece that I had published. I collaborated with, the second is actually, you can still access Health News Review through the wonderful Internet Archive Wayback Machine. So that snapshot of the homepage that I showed you earlier, this link will take you to much of the site. It's not perfect, but it'll show you much more than that I've just showed you. And then the bottom article was another article I collaborated with some other researchers. So I thank you for your attention. We have still have some time here for questions and discussion. And for just a minute here, I'll leave my links and social media contacts here in case any of you want to follow up with me. Someday, Adam and Adrian, I hope one of these students comes back to me and says, you know what? In my career, I want to relaunch healthnewsreview.org. Can you help me? So
that's obviously a great aspiration, and we hope it comes true.
Okay, so now as we move into our Q&A portion, we're going to take questions from students first and then the general public. But to start us off, Mr. Schweitzer, I had a question. What techniques would you recommend people using in order to kind of serve as more of a preventative measure before consuming inaccurate data or information?
Well, that's why I was so fond of the 10 criteria that we applied to at least stories that included an intervention. And I should give credit where it's due. I didn't create those criteria. There was a pioneering site at the University of Newcastle in Australia that launched a site in 2004. Remember, we started in 2006, called Media Doctor Australia. At one point, there were 6 such sites doing almost exactly the same work around the globe. Now, I think that only one in one in Germany is still standing on 2 legs, thanks to pretty good foundation funding over there. So, I mean, if we could teach people to, just as a starting point, look, is this a single source story? Again, run for the hills, because if it's a single source story and you have not asked about or explored conflicts of interest in that source, you could just be taking spoon-fed information, giving it to the audience, and the audience, to your question, is not prepared to deal with that. But I think that they could be by just when you see a single source story on healthcare topics, I would move on. And then some of these other things come into play. If you don't see help with numeracy issues, like, is this absolute risk reduction figures I'm seeing here, or am I being sold a bill of goods with relative risk reduction that tends to make new products look as good as they possibly can, and in a numerical sense that really means far less to the general public? So that would be my best quick answer, is to look at how we analyze claims with our 10 criteria and try to apply them in your own life.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll have Hannah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. So earlier you mentioned the harms of social media platforms like Facebook and X, and TikTok comes to mind as well. So how do you think we should approach combating the spread of health misinformation and disinformation in these spaces?
This may sound easier said than done, but I've seen a number of people that I've suggested this to do it with success. When you see things that you know are wrong, are incomplete, I would strongly suggest that you as an individual, or you in whatever institutional or group setting that you're in, the students in this program, the faculty at Georgetown, the members of a patient advocacy group, either individually or as a group, to go to the editors of that organization, to write letters to the editor, to write comments in the comment section following some of these publications online. I love reading reader comments following New York Times, Washington Post, anybody that has a comment offering after the posted news story. It shows the public is not dumb, and the public is learning some of these skills and learning how to, even if they can't do the nitty gritty of figuring out absolute versus relative risk, don't have the wherewithal to look up conflicts of interest, although something Adrian and I worked on could help with that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. At the very least, if their instincts say something doesn't smell right here, they could write that in the comment section or in the letters to the editor. But also, if this is beyond your personal means, again, within a group setting, there are biostatisticians and epidemiologists that would love to get involved pro bono in helping news and public messaging become better. So I've often said, if you really are serious about analyzing some of these claims, you should have a biostatistician in your hip pocket, because they'll help you rip apart the study methodology, the claims that are made in the study. The thing that Adrian and I have worked on for God knows how many years, and is still alive, and hopefully we'll have some new energy and a rebirth, is a list of industry independent experts that we sort of had split targets in mind when we started this. Shannon Brownlee and Jeannie Linzer, two Bulldog investigative journalists, started this, and then Adrian and I and some others came on board helping with it. Those two audiences were journalists. So if you are facing a daily quota, you got to do more stories with less, and you got websites like Health News Review telling you that you've got to have an independent source, and you don't know where to begin, and the clock is ticking. You got to do 3 more stories today. We launched a list that now has more than 100 folks with interdisciplinary backgrounds who have sworn to us that they have had no ties to industry within the past 5 years and don't have it right now, and that they'd be willing to help journalists with their stories. The other target audience was the FDA, who would often say, stop blaming us for having conflicted people on our committees. Everybody's conflicted. We can't find any. Well, if this little mom and pop group that Adrian and I and Shannon Brownlee and Jeannie Linzer are in can come up with more than 100 names, there's more than that. And so we could actually, Adam or Adrian, maybe we can post a link to where that list of industry independent experts now resides, and get it in front of the students and others who are on this Zoom. Was that helpful to the question? I hope.
Yes, thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Abrielle.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk today. You had mentioned that academic journals had previously never had a place in news and were never intended to be a part of the news cycle. Do you think on the publisher side that there's been a shift in what papers are accepted, considering now that they are being more incorporated into our daily news cycle? And if so, what responsibility do academic publishing institutions have to edit the process of accepting articles considering this?
Yeah, I can't prove it. It's a great question, but yeah, I believe that this isn't exactly what you asked, but this is what I'm hearing, what I'm processing. So journals have this impact factor, which I'm not going to get into. It's some algorithm of what impact things in their journal have on clinicians, researchers, and the public. Aside from that, they clearly care about media coverage, or they wouldn't be sending out news releases. JAMA for years, the Journal of the AMA, and I got to believe they're still doing this, would spoon feed television reporters by actually doing video news releases. So it was instant news story, just add water. It would be a script. It would be professionally done video. It would be an interview, usually a single source interview with whoever was in the JAMA paper that was published. And so for a long time, and I haven't kept up with this, things published in JAMA got a hell of a lot more news coverage than things in other comparable impact factor journals. I wish more were done by more journals to help the general public, but you don't want to discourage, even though they're not meant to be a source of daily news, when you get smart, well-informed, well-trained consumers, let them come in and see the data themselves. Let them learn how to read past the abstract. Let them look at the methods, as all of you should, the methods section of the paper. Let them look at the limitations section of the paper. I could just puke at the number of stories I see that list no caveats, no limitations. And when I look at the study that their story is based on, the limitations section, honestly put, is this long. It's right there, spoon-fed for you, and it doesn't become a part of the story. But where I started off with that is, I think that if journals are going to play to the general public, as I think they do by having media departments pushing the things that are published in their journals, they have an obligation to try to help the general public learn how to discern what's good and what isn't in what's published in their journal and elsewhere. Is that to the heart of your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Tell me if it's not.
Next, we have a question from Katie.
Hi, this has been really interesting. When I was in undergrad in one of my classes, one of the assignments that we had to do was find a kind of sensationalized news article that talked about some new health intervention or situation, and then go to the actual source, like the actual journal article, and read it. And kind of we discussed as a class whether or not we agreed with how the news article portrayed the store, like the actual research. And I think that was like a really great kind of introduction to this topic. But all of us in the class had a more scientific background, had an understanding of journal articles and how they kind of come to be, as well as research. So you kind of were touching on this in the last question, but I guess how do you recommend that somebody who doesn't have a scientific background begin to kind of dive into some of these ideas when they might not feel comfortable understanding the actual data and what's being listed?
Yeah. Before I answer, this was undergrad?
Yeah.
Where and what was the class? What setting and what was the class?
I went to Georgetown also for my undergrad. I was in their School of Health. The class was an epidemiology class. Um, and as just kind of part of it, we were looking at general sources of news. The professor was Anka Dragomir. I don't know if you are aware of her, but
That sounds terrific. I I was director of graduate studies for a health journalism graduate program that I helped launch at the University of Minnesota. And but I always wanted to teach an undergrad class, and uh, had a hard time selling that idea until one of my last years. And I think I got more satisfaction, frankly, from teaching the undergrads than with the bread and butter, the graduate program. So that sounds pretty cool. Um, well, again, I'm not going to break both arms patting us on the back, but I thought that our approach, this is why we did, we were miscast, and I sort of take the brunt of this for many years as being only about journalism. In fact, when I showed that wallet card of our criteria, went down the wrong path, and we had a picture of a bulldog with a newspaper in his mouth, and the tagline was "Your Health News Watchdog." And I stopped that after a short period of time because it was getting away from the realization that journalists were really not our primary target audience. It was the general public. We were looking at journalism as the low-hanging fruit. They have tremendous reach. And if we could show the general public, if we can get them to follow us, and we did, if we can show them how we analyze the claims in these stories and the claims that come down those ladders spun from the government agency or the medical center onto the PR people, onto the journalists, onto them, then they can become smarter healthcare consumers as well. And so we did help train people in how to ascertain the difference and the importance between absolute and relative risk. We did help to train members of the general public to look for, is this a surrogate marker, or is this something we that really tells us whether somebody lived longer and better? Is this an observational study that makes claims about cause and effect when observational studies cannot do that? And I think that there are other good online resources that people could turn to. I've only recently, only in the past 2 months, have I been on Substack, and I'm blown away by the number of smart, devoted people. I don't know how they work full time. I'm retired now, in their careers, and still manage to outpublish me on a daily basis on their Substacks. So, and if you find somebody you like and trust on Substack, as probably some of you have seen if you use that platform, that person often gives recommendations to other sites. And so this feeds off itself. And pretty soon you've got a list of contacts or a list of sources that you want to follow that can help you on many of these topics.
Next, we have a question from Dr. Myers.
Thanks, Gary. I've enjoyed this, and I start with a comment, which is that you mentioned impact factors, and impact factors are really, they kind of operate on algorithms that are similar to social media. And I would warn people from putting too much emphasis on impact factors that they're really ways that are that self-perpetuate and expand the perceived quality of the best journals. And the best journals have more and more sub-journals or other journals associated with them, and whole careers are built around just trying to publish only in Nature and Science or New England Journal, etc. And that's really a problem in my view, although I might be the only person saying that. Um, my question is this. So a lot of the things that you brought up about what ought to be the rigorous way that a health journalist looks at information and then presents it to their readers could apply to any journalist, right? You just have to change the language a little bit here and there, tweak some of those rules or guidelines that you're talking about. And then, and we know that doesn't happen, and it's getting worse and worse. So, one question is, what can we do in this world to kind of increase the quality of journalism in general, not just in the health field? And well, I'm asking too much at once, so let me just leave it at that.
Um, we could do a semester's worth of seminars on ideas that are kicked around, and you wonder where they ever lead, to bail out the journalism industry. I think that, as I pointed out, just two examples of foundation-supported excellent endeavors, ProPublica and Kaiser Health News, which I think now goes by KFF Health News for Kaiser Family Foundation. But we don't all have sway with foundations. I'll go back to what I suggested earlier, that to vote with your voice or vote with your feet, but to let editors know when you find some things that are subpar. If you don't do it, who will? The next guy, the next woman may not do it. And I look at some of the faces on the screen here, and we have some very smart folks who are going to be smarter as they continue their careers. And I hope you see these opportunities and act on them, because having worked in newsrooms for a long time, when you don't hear something from the general public, when you don't hear something from your bosses, you go home that night thinking, dodged another bullet today, met my quota, no complaints, no constructive criticism, no comments. And with where we are with the struggles in the journalism industry right now, we need to have much more of a public, open exchange about what's being done, what's not being done, what we need from the news that they don't seem to get that we need. And if we don't tell them that, we're going to get more of the same. So if they care about more than click rates, and if they care about driving up the numbers, so many news organizations say we don't, we're losing our audience, we don't know where they're going. It's because, well, I've often felt, I work at the intersection. This is not for vampires here. I work at the intersection of medicine and media, two industries that you would think would be more plugged into their needs of the public they serve, and yet oftentimes are not. And so for just looking at journalism for a moment, I think that there's a great opportunity to become much more engaged with what people need, expect, want, and are dissatisfied with and are not getting. And if they don't come to you, I'm just urging people to go to them with letters to the editor, with a meeting with the editorial board, especially if you have some body of people behind you. When you stop and think about it, when you see a guest op-ed piece, how did that get there? And oftentimes, I'll bet 9 times out of 10, it's because somebody met with the editorial board and explained why this issue they want to address is important. So if you haven't done that on the individual or the group level, I think that you should open your minds to that approach.
Thank you so much, Mr. Schweitzer. I wanted to just have a reminder that if anyone has any questions, either HAPI students or listeners, feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand. For the time being, I also had another question. The cards that you were talking about at the beginning of the presentation, were those particularly effective, or did you see any direct impacts from them?
Yeah. Yeah, the cards and the mouse pads that we gave out would fly off the table, and then you don't know if they're being used until you get the feedback. And I would get feedback from journalists saying that their editor would consistently cut things out of their draft story that we were calling for in our criteria on the mousepad or the wallet cards. And so they at least felt they could wave this wallet card or this mousepad and say, this isn't just me that thinks this is important. There's this group that's reviewing 6,000 media messages that has learned from what's missing in those messages and thinks it's important. And they've got quite a following. So, and then I would hear from journalists. I remember one in particular with a very prominent newswire service who said, I've learned your 10 criteria, and I got to tell you, the one that helped, the one thing that comes out of that mousepad that helps me the most, two-pronged, to discuss costs, which is so easy to leave out, and do I have a second source? Is it an independent source? Have I looked at conflicts of interest in the source? So anecdotal feedback like that became, very gratifying. And I think that in the case of that wire service, I don't know this for a fact, that they made this change because some of what we or others were urging be done, but I saw in the course of our 16-year history a distinct change in the style of that wire service, which has international reach, in sometimes not reporting on things at all because they were applying stricter judgment about what was ready for prime time and what was newsworthy, and other times maybe reacting because they knew everyone else was going to have this story and they were going to do it their way with absolute versus relative risk explained, with a caveat that observational research association does not mean causation, with limitations of surrogate endpoints. And I'll tell you, when I saw those kinds of stories, it just boosted my morale. Because it could be hard slogging through this same drudgery every day. The daily drumbeat of dreck, I often would call it. But I used to draw a picture in my talks of these periodic mountains of excellence in journalism, which still do exist, but that oftentimes the valleys in between those mountains, the daily drumbeat of dreck down here at the bottom, were becoming wider and deeper. Applaud the work that you see the ProPublicas and the Kaiser Health News folks and others doing when you see it. Recently, I was a judge for the Lown Institute's annual Shkreli Awards, named after convicted felon, wasn't it Martin Shkreli? I forgot his first name, Martin Shkreli, I think. And so 10 of the worst examples in healthcare dysfunction and conflicts of interest and other bad things in healthcare were reported in these candidates for the annual Shkreli Awards. And in looking at the news coverage, it was really encouraging to see how much investigative work, deep dives, not quick hit short stories, were and are still being done in American journalism. Those nominees and the stories are still on the Lown Institute, L-O-W-N, the lowninstitute.org, I think is their URL. Just look for the Shkreli Awards, S-H-K-R-E-L-I. And there are lessons to be learned from the review and the comments on those stories and the dysfunction behind them.
Thank you so much. That's super interesting. It looks like we have a question in the chat from Mitsuo Tomita, and then we'll follow up with the question with Mr. Grogan. But the first question is, can you explain the 1 in 8 breast cancer?
Yeah, so just in simplistic terms, because I'm not a biostatistician, I just learned from them. When you hear the 1 in 8, that's looking at all women, lifetime risk, not helping you with where you are now. And so, do I need to go back to that slide? Well, I don't think I need to. I remember that if for women 30 to 39, so many of them beyond what even some of the most aggressive guidelines would recommend, are urging 30 to 39-year-old women to get regular mammograms, and just without having a good discussion about the trade-offs between potential benefits and potential harms. And that's not a 1 in 8 group. In the 30s, it's 1 in 233. And in the 60 to 69 age group, when you're living in that time span, you don't have a 1 to 8 risk. That would be spread over a lifetime. Right then, you have a 1 in 29 risk. So it's just, it's using the most frightening number, the most impressive number that you know will get in a headline, that you know will get in every story, without explaining what it means. And it's, frankly, I think it's fear-mongering. And as I said, those women trying to make a decision need more facts, more help with numeracy, and not more fear-mongering. And some of the breast cancer advocacy groups are famous for this kind of pinkwashing, as it's called. I happen to be, I don't mind saying this, a huge fan of the National Breast Cancer Coalition there in Washington. I know their leadership. I've given talks at their conferences for years. And I think that the women in that organization roll out of bed in the morning put their pants on, and they start the day from an evidentiary standpoint. Sure, they've got to worry about fundraising to stay in business, but they don't start with, can we have pink garbage cans and pink garbage trucks and have basketball players wearing pink basketball shoes, and it's money, 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 and 1 in 8 statistics, and everybody should be screened at every age for everything. They start with an analysis of what's the evidence. And they have training that these 4 women who were on our review team, all of whom had breast cancer, all of whom went through that training. Adrian, can you help me remember? Its project starts with an E, and I can't think of.
It's Project Lead.
Project Lead starts with an L. Yeah, and I wish. So, to some of these earlier questions about, what can the unwashed do to improve their own analytical skills, and how can they become smarter when they see something? I wish that training like that would be offered by more organizations. Journals could publish a Project Lead type training. Now you got me going. The reason I would keep going back, I must have gone back 6 or 7 times and spoken at their annual conference. And they would sometimes say to me, you don't need to stay for the whole conference. You can just, fly in, do your talk, and go home. And I said, no, because I learn every time I come. And so you would take in Project Lead, you still do take women who are only there because of the fate that they incurred of having a diagnosis of breast cancer. And you have brought them up to speed in a week of some pretty rigorous training on how to be a smarter healthcare consumer and how to help other women. So I think the world of what that organization does and what that training does, and there should be more like it.
Up next, we have a question from John Grogan.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you very much for your presentation. But more importantly, thank you for the vision of your life's work. I have a couple of questions. Contemporary heroes in muckraking journalism. Could you drop a name or two of some outstanding individuals? And cautions for 2025. Can you foresee unique conditions that may be relevant to your audience today? And finally, I'm thinking dependence on artificial intelligence and concentration of wealth. I wonder if, thank you.
I have to get up and look at my bookcase for a minute. There's one hero that I want to talk about, but I've got to refresh my memory. Hold on a minute. I'm not leaving you. Well, a couple of things here. This is fresh in my mind because I just finished his latest book. I think the world of a faculty colleague at the University of Minnesota, Carl Elliott, who has found out what it's like to be a medical whistleblower on a case of a young man who committed suicide on a psychiatric drug trial. And I won't go into you can look this up. But Carl has just, almost looks like I meant to have this prompt. He's just read this book, and you can't see that because of the blur. It's The Occasional Human Sacrifice, Medical Experimentation, and the Price of Saying No. I know that Adrian has had Carl to Washington to speak at many of the farmed out conferences. And this is one of the best books on healthcare that I've ever read. I took it with me to the beach at Cancun a couple of weeks ago. I wrote to Carl. I had a picture of my feet in the sand and the book in the foreground. And I said, I brought you with me on vacation. And you haven't ruined my vacation, although you did your best, because it's story after story after story of the history of other whistleblowers that will just rock you to the core. Starting with the Tuskegee experiment, going on through the Willowbrook School, which was not political correctness, called Willowbrook School for the Mentally Disabled, I think, where they injected kids with hepatitis, pretty much saying, we've got rampant hepatitis in this institution anyway, so they're all going to get it. So we're going to learn from what it's like to take people who don't have it and inject them with it, and on and on and on. So he's at the top of my list, John. One book that jumped out at me, Selling Sickness by Ray Moynihan in Australia and Alan Castles in British Columbia. I think about, I worked for years at Dartmouth. There are many folks there I could point to. Jack Winberg was my mentor there. He's since passed on. He was a big supporter of Health News Review, of outcomes research, and on shared decision making. But he was a lure of wonderful talent. And so one guy that comes to mind is Gilbert Welch, who's now in Boston. So you can look up his work as well. Boy, it's such a good question. John, I hate to be incomplete. I almost feel like I want to follow up with the group by putting more thought into this and giving you a list after the fact. Can I do that, Adam?
Sure. Send it along to me. And by the way, we've had Carl Elliott speak in this series, and I wouldn't be surprised if he would show up here again later this year or perhaps next in one of our seminars, but no immediate plans. I think we're going to have to call it a day, John, if you'll forgive us. And part of that's because Gary's given such great, meaningful answers to everybody's questions. And I thank you for being here and bringing to our attention some of the basic important principles that I think our students who end up in things that involve journalism should live by. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our moderator, Michaela. But thanks again.
It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. And I'm thankful for the opportunity after 50 years of doing this. Now in retirement, it's nice to know that somebody still remembers and cares.
Absolutely.
To echo Dr. Myers a little bit, on behalf of the Health and the Public Interest Program, I want to thank you, Mr. Schweitzer, for joining us today. I think I can speak for all of us. We really enjoyed your presentation and learned a bunch. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us today.